The snow was falling in heavy sheets that morning, muffling the usual noise of downtown Albany. Officer Grace Halstead sat on a cold steel bench outside a corner diner, her uniform jacket zipped to her neck, a steaming container of fried chicken resting on her lap. Her shift had started at sunrise, and she'd barely had time to think, let alone eat. The sharp scent of grease and salt floated in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of winter. Everything was still, until she noticed a shadow breaking the whiteness ahead. Out of the swirling snow emerged a German shepherd, thin and ragged, his coat dulled with dirt and ice. He didn't bark or growl. He just stood there on the sidewalk, watching her. His ears were half lowered, but his eyes, those deep amber eyes, were fixed on her with a look she couldn't ignore. There was something behind that gaze. Not just hunger, but recognition. A kind of quiet, heartbreaking hope. Grace didn't move at first. She knew better than to approach strays, especially big ones. But this wasn't just any dog. There was a stillness in him, a discipline. Slowly, she reached into her container, tore off a piece of chicken, and extended her hand. The dog stepped forward cautiously, took the food gently from her fingers, and backed away without breaking eye contact. His movements were precise, controlled, like a soldier waiting for orders. Inside the diner, her partner Hank Morrissey chuckled through the window. He tapped the glass and mouthed, "Don't feed the damn thing." But Grace ignored him. Her instincts were buzzing. Something about this dog felt trained, experienced. She tested a theory. "Sit," she said softly. The shepherd sat immediately, without hesitation. Her breath caught in her throat. Hank stepped outside, rubbing his gloved hands. "You really think he's one of ours?" he asked, nodding toward the dog. Grace didn't answer. She stepped closer to the animal and noticed a faded tattoo inside his right ear. A number. Regulation issue. Her heart skipped. "He's XK9, she whispered. The dog looked up at her again, almost as if confirming it. Then, without warning, he turned and began walking away, looking back over his shoulder like he wanted her to follow. Grace hesitated. Snow clung to her boots as she stood. Her gut told her this wasn't random. The dog, Ranger, as she'd later call him, wasn't wandering. He was leading her. Somewhere out there in the snow, a story was waiting to be uncovered, and she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it would change everything. Grace followed the dog through a narrow side street, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. The city around her faded into silence, the tall brick buildings absorbing the distant sounds of traffic. Ranger walked ahead with calm determination, his paws leaving sharp prints behind him. He didn't stop to sniff or explore. He moved like he had a destination. Grace glanced back toward the main road. Hank was still by the diner, watching her like she'd lost her mind. They turned down a slushy alley behind an old auto repair shop. Graffiti covered the walls, and a row of overflowing dumpsters lined one side. Ranger slowed, then came to a full stop at a locked gate. His ears perked up. Grace approached, unsure of what she was supposed to see, until she noticed the faintest trace of red in the snow. Her breath caught. Blood, still fresh, not yet frozen. It trailed toward the gate and disappeared underneath it. Her training kicked in. Grace radioed the station, requesting a unit to her location. But part of her didn't want backup, not yet. This felt personal. She crouched near the blood and inspected the snow. There were human footprints, dragging slightly like someone had been injured. Ranger sniffed the base of the gate, then sat back on his haunches, eyes locked on hers. He was waiting again, watching her, trusting her to understand what he couldn't say. She scaled the gate using the crates stacked nearby and dropped into the lot on the other side. The area was deserted, except for an abandoned shed with a rusted metal door hanging half open. Grace stepped carefully, her hand resting on her holstered weapon. Ranger stayed by the gate, whining low in his throat. She pushed the door open and immediately felt the shift in air. Musty, stale, and tinged with the sharp odor of old oil and something else. Decay. Inside the shed was a mattress on the floor, a few torn blankets, and an open duffel bag with some scattered belongings. Grace's eyes scanned quickly, then froze on what lay in the corner. A police badge. She stepped forward, brushing off the dust. The name read Thomas Gallagher. Her mind reeled. That name wasn't unfamiliar. He was a former K-9 officer, declared missing nearly 2 years ago. Outside, Ranger barked once, sharp and urgent. Grace stuffed the badge in her pocket and rushed back to the gate. The dog was now pacing, agitated. Something else was happening. Something close. And Grace had the chilling feeling that whoever had been in that shed might not be far at all. Grace crouched beside the gate again, her gloved fingers gripping the cold metal as Ranger paced back and forth with growing urgency. His behavior had shifted. He wasn't just alert, he was anxious. The dog's body language was sharp, trained, like he was preparing for something. She'd seen this posture before, during drills with active K-9s. He wasn't reacting to a memory. He was sensing someone nearby. Her breath fogged in the air as she scanned the alley behind them. Nothing, just snow and silence. But the feeling was there, that itch on the back of her neck that every officer learns to trust. She looked down at Ranger. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. He whined, then bolted a few steps down the alley, stopping only when he saw she wasn't following. That bark again, sharp, clipped, deliberate. He wanted her to move. Now, she followed him past the dumpsters and down a narrow path between 2 buildings. The wind cut through like a blade, and the smell of wet concrete and rotting trash lingered in the air. Ranger stopped suddenly, ears up, and sniffed the base of a rusted stairwell. Grace knelt beside him, brushing away the snow. A handprint, smudged in blood, marked the wall. It wasn't large, maybe a woman's, but it was fresh. Her heart pounded as she reached for her radio again. Unit 42 requesting immediate backup at 38th and Laurel. Possible injured person on foot. She stood, eyes darting around the empty alley. The handprint, the blood trail, the abandoned shed. This wasn't just a vagrant hiding from the cold. It was something deeper. And that badge, Tom Gallagher. His name wasn't just familiar. It was a name she'd heard her mother mention in whispers years ago, late at night, during one of those rare, vulnerable conversations. Grace pulled out her phone and searched the precinct's digital archives. It took only seconds for the profile to appear. Detective Thomas Gallagher, former K-9 handler, declared missing in 2023 during an internal investigation involving misuse of police dogs and allegations of corruption. Case closed due to lack of evidence. No body, no trace, just silence. Until now, a distant clatter echoed from the fire escape above. Grace froze. Ranger growled low in his throat, his eyes locked on the shadows above them. The metal creaked once. Then again. Someone was up there, watching, listening, maybe even waiting. Grace reached for her weapon, pulse racing. This wasn't just a cold trail anymore. She'd stepped into something alive, something dangerous. And as snow began to fall harder around them, she knew one thing for certain. Tom Gallagher's story wasn't over. The sound of creaking metal faded as Grace scanned the fire escape. Nothing moved. The snow had started falling harder, blanketing everything in white and softening the edges of the alley. Still, the feeling of being watched clung to her like static. Ranger stood at her side, stiff, alert, his gaze locked on the top level of the stairs. Whoever had been there was gone now, if they were ever really there at all. Grace exhaled slowly, lowering her weapon but keeping it ready. Her radio crackled to life. Unit 42 back up en route. ETA 4 minutes. She clicked the receiver. Copy. Her voice was steady, but her thoughts weren't. The blood, the badge, the handprint, it was all pointing to something that didn't make sense. Tom Gallagher was missing, presumed dead, wrapped in a case most officers had either forgotten or deliberately avoided. So why was his badge sitting in a shack with fresh blood on the ground? She looked down at Ranger, who now sat calmly at her feet, his ears twitching at the distant sound of approaching sirens. "You knew him, didn't you?" she whispered. The dog didn't respond, of course, but his expression shifted. Less tense, more focused. It was eerie how intelligent his eyes were. Grace had seen working dogs before, but Ranger was different. There was grief in him. Not just training. Not just instinct. Loss. Memories surfaced, blurred fragments from her childhood. Her mother, Eleanor, sitting on the front porch late at night, whispering on the phone. A name, Tom, spoken with urgency. Grace had been too young to understand, but old enough to remember the tone. Fear, protectiveness, and something else. Guilt. She made a mental note to ask her mother about it, even though she already knew how that conversation would go. Eleanor never talked about the past, especially not anything involving the department. The backup unit finally arrived, 2 officers she vaguely recognized from patrol. She gave a brief rundown, downplaying the emotional undercurrent while pointing out the shed, the handprint, and the direction the suspect might have gone. They nodded and began sweeping the area. But Grace couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. Whoever had been watching had vanished into the storm. She glanced at Ranger one last time before heading back toward her cruiser. He trotted beside her now, not leading, not following, walking with her. And as she opened the passenger door and he leapt inside without hesitation, something shifted in her chest. This wasn't just a stray dog anymore. This was a partner. And whatever truth was buried beneath the snow, they'd dig it up together. Back at the precinct, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the squad room. Grace sat at her desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure where to begin. Ranger lay quietly at her feet, his head resting between his paws, eyes never fully closed. He hadn't left her side since the alley. Not once. There was a quiet understanding between them now, not just handler and dog, but something deeper. Both of them were chasing ghosts. She pulled up the archived case file on Detective Tom Gallagher. The report was thin. Too thin. A few vague paragraphs about an internal investigation, a note about his disappearance during administrative leave, and a final status, case closed. Presumed dead. No follow-up. No interviews. No timeline. It was as if someone had scrubbed the file clean. Her jaw tightened. She clicked into internal memos. Most were locked behind access privileges. But one stood out, barely visible in the metadata. A deleted message forwarded to then-Captain Roy Kavanaugh. No content, just a timestamp. Grace stood and walked down the hall to the records room. It smelled of dust and old ink, and the silence was so thick it rang in her ears. She pulled the paper file for Gallagher's case from the cabinet, flipping through the yellowed pages. One photo fell loose, a black and white shot of Gallagher in uniform, smiling next to a German shepherd. Ranger. Younger, healthier, but unmistakably him. Her chest tightened. This wasn't just a missing person. This was a buried story. Back at her desk, she picked up her phone and called her mother. Eleanor Halstead answered after the third ring, her voice soft and guarded. "Grace? Are you okay?" Grace hesitated. "Mom, do you remember a man named Tom Gallagher?" Silence. Then a sharp inhale. "Why are you asking about him?" Grace could hear the fear behind the question. She pressed. "He was a K-9 handler. Missing since 2023. You mentioned his name once." "I remember." Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. "You need to be careful, Grace. That case, it wasn't what it looked like. Tom wasn't dirty. He found something about how the department was using the dogs. They tried to shut him up." Grace's throat tightened. "Did you know him?" Another pause. Then, quietly, "He was your father's partner, and he tried to protect us." The line went dead. Grace sat frozen, phone still in her hand. Her father had died in the line of duty when she was 11. She'd never known the full story. Now, for the first time, it felt like she was about to. Ranger nudged her leg gently, eyes searching hers. Whatever this was, it ran deeper than she ever imagined, and it had just become personal. Grace stared at the empty call screen, her mother's voice still echoing in her mind. "He tried to protect us." Those 5 words had shattered the fragile wall she'd built around her childhood memories. Her father's death had always been explained as a tragic accident during a bust gone wrong. But now everything felt different, twisted, incomplete. Ranger looked up at her, as if sensing the shift in her breathing, steady but shaken. She leaned back in her chair, mind racing. If Tom Gallagher had been her father's partner, and if he'd uncovered something dark inside the department, then his disappearance wasn't about misconduct. It was a cover-up. The badge in the shed, the blood, the handprint, they were puzzle pieces, and every piece seemed to be pointing back to Captain Roy Cavanaugh. He'd been around during that investigation. He had signed off on Gallagher's case file, and now he was acting like none of it ever happened. Grace stood, her voice low but steady as she addressed Ranger. "We need to pay the captain a visit." Ranger rose without hesitation. They moved through the precinct like shadows, slipping down the hall toward Cavanaugh's office. The blinds were drawn, but a light was on inside. Grace knocked twice, firm. No answer. She tried the knob unlocked. The office was empty, but something about the air felt disturbed, like someone had left in a hurry. She stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. The walls were lined with plaques and photographs. Cavanaugh shaking hands with mayors, standing next to awards, always smiling. But the desk was what caught her attention. Papers scattered, a drawer slightly ajar. Grace opened it slowly and found an old leather-bound folder marked Internal Affairs, 2023. Inside were surveillance photos. Dogs. Officers. One photo made her freeze. It was her father. Young. Alive. Standing beside Tom Gallagher and a dog that looked just like Ranger, except smaller. There was more. A signed complaint form with Gallagher's name, alleging misconduct in the K-9 unit. A handwritten note at the bottom. "Will handle internally RC. Roy Cavanaugh." He hadn't just buried the case, he'd silenced it. Grace's stomach turned. Everything her family had believed about her father's legacy was a lie. He hadn't died during a routine arrest. He died chasing the same truth Gallagher had found. And now that she was digging, someone might be watching her too. A sound broke her thoughts, a faint click. The office door. It was closing. Someone else was inside. Grace froze as the office door clicked shut behind her. The soft thud echoed through the quiet room like a gunshot. Her hand instinctively went to her holster. Ranger stood rigid beside her, his ears up, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Whoever had entered hadn't spoken, hadn't announced themselves. That silence alone told her everything. This wasn't an officer on routine patrol. This was someone who didn't want to be seen. She turned quickly, but the office was dim. The only light came from the desk lamp, casting long shadows across the carpet. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice firm. No answer. Her eyes locked on the movement just beyond the edge of the desk. A figure, tall, motionless. Then the voice came, low and bitter. "You should have left it alone, Grace." The figure stepped forward, and the light hit his face. "Captain Roy Cavanaugh." Her pulse surged. "You knew," she said coldly. "About my father. About Gallagher. You covered it all up." Cavanaugh didn't flinch. "I did what I had to do. Your father, he couldn't let things go. He got too close to people who didn't want the system changed. Gallagher, too. They were good men, stubborn, but good. But they didn't understand that sometimes. The truth burns more than it helps." Ranger stepped between them, body tense, eyes locked on Cavanaugh like he remembered him. Grace noticed the man's hand inching toward his waist. Slowly, deliberately. "Don't," she warned. "I've already called backup." A lie, but her tone was convincing. Cavanaugh hesitated, then sneered. "You're just like your father, always believing there's justice at the end of this road. But there isn't. There's just survival." His eyes dropped to Ranger. That dog should have died with Gallagher. In that moment, everything clicked. The blood in the shed, the fear in her mother's voice, the silence in the files. Cavanaugh hadn't just buried the investigation. He'd hunted down everyone tied to it, and now she was next. But Grace didn't back down. "You made a mistake," she said. "You thought the past would stay buried. But it didn't. He came back." She nodded toward Ranger. "And now he remembers." Cavanaugh's expression twisted, rage bubbling beneath his carefully controlled mask. He stepped forward just once. Ranger lunged. Not to kill, not to maim, but to protect. The two figures collided with the desk, knocking it sideways. Grace moved fast, pulling her cuffs from her belt as the struggle hit the floor. Years of training kicked in. In less than 10 seconds, Kavanaugh was face down, restrained, and breathing hard. Grace stood over him, heart pounding. For the first time, the truth had a witness. The silence after the arrest was deafening. Grace sat alone in the interrogation room, staring at the steel table in front of her, fingers locked tightly together. Ranger lay at her feet, as he always did now, calm but alert. The precinct was in chaos. Internal affairs had arrived within the hour, and Captain Roy Kavanaugh was being processed 2 floors below. But the real storm was inside her. The questions, the guilt, the truth. She kept hearing her mother's voice. He tried to protect us, and now she finally understood. Her father hadn't been some hero who died on a random raid. He'd been digging too deep, asking questions about the K-9 program, questions that led straight to corruption, abuse, and men like Kavanaugh. Gallagher had tried to warn him, had tried to expose it, and now, 20 years later, the trail of silence was breaking. Grace was the one forcing it open. The file she'd recovered from Kavanaugh's office was now evidence, and inside were names. Officers who'd signed off on false reports, dogs who had gone missing, payments that didn't match department budgets. It wasn't just Kavanaugh. It was a network, and someone had tried very hard to make sure it all disappeared with Tom Gallagher. Grace stared at Ranger. He'd survived all of it, alone, waiting for someone to listen. Later that night, she returned home and called her mother again. Eleanor Halstead answered with a tired voice, but didn't sound surprised. "They told me back then to keep quiet," she said after a long pause. "That if I spoke, you might grow up without a mother too." Grace's throat tightened. "You knew he didn't just die in the line of duty." Her mother was quiet. "I knew. He was getting too close to something dangerous. Tom came to the house once, the night before your father was killed. He begged him to stop digging. And he didn't," Grace whispered. "No," Eleanor said. "He wouldn't stop, just like you." Grace felt the weight of legacy settle into her chest. Her father had died for the truth. Gallagher had vanished trying to finish what he started. And now she was carrying both of their burdens, and their hope. She looked down at Ranger, who rested his head gently on her lap. He'd carried it too in silence for years. But now, they weren't alone anymore. And for the first time, someone was finally listening. The next morning, the sun rose over Albany with a rare softness, melting some of the snow that had blanketed the city for days. But inside the precinct, everything felt heavier. Grace sat before a group of internal affairs officers and federal investigators, her voice calm but steady as she walked them through every document, every timeline, every connection. Names she once trusted now filled a list of suspects. And at the center of it all was a dog who had carried the truth on his back. Ranger. They listened. This time they truly listened. With Kavanaugh in custody and the file from his office now fully decrypted, the entire operation had been exposed. Gallagher had been right from the beginning. The abuse of K-9 units, the falsified reports, the disappearances. All of it had been sanctioned and buried under decades of loyalty and silence. What had once been dismissed as a conspiracy now stood as undeniable fact. Grace watched as officers who had trained her avoided eye contact in the hallway. Some were complicit. Others had simply stayed quiet. But now their silence was breaking. Word had spread. And in the center of the growing investigation, Grace had become something unexpected. A symbol. Not of vengeance, but of reckoning. She hadn't just exposed corruption. She had given a voice to the fallen, to the dogs who were used and discarded, and to the men like Tom Gallagher who were punished for telling the truth. That afternoon, she visited the city's police memorial wall. Snow clung to the base of the stone, where her father's name had been carved years ago. She knelt, pressing her palm gently against it. "You weren't wrong," she whispered. "You just ran out of time." Ranger sat beside her, calm and still, his eyes scanning the horizon like he always did, vigilant, as if still protecting something sacred. A soft voice interrupted the moment. "Detective Halstead?" Grace turned to find a young woman from Internal Affairs. "There's something you should see," she said, handing over a file. Inside was a scanned report, never entered into the system. A final dispatch log from 2023. A call from Tom Gallagher the night he vanished. Coordinates. A location deep in the woods north of the city. One last place he tried to reach. Grace closed the folder slowly. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with purpose. Gallagher hadn't just died in silence. He'd left a final message, a final trail, one she was now ready to follow. And this time she wouldn't be going alone. The road north was quiet, winding through tall pines dusted with frost. Grace drove slowly, her eyes fixed on the GPS coordinates from Tom Gallagher's final dispatch. The further she got from the city, the quieter the world became. No sirens, no voices, just the sound of tires over ice and the soft breathing of Ranger in the back seat. He sat upright, eyes forward, as if he already knew where they were going. They reached the trailhead just after noon. The path was overgrown, barely visible beneath the thin layer of snow, but the terrain matched the coordinates exactly. Grace stepped out and adjusted her coat. Ranger jumped down beside her, his tail still, his body tense. They moved together in silence, the air crisp and sharp, broken only by the crunch of their steps. Grace didn't know what she would find. Bones, a shelter, a clue. But she knew one thing. Gallagher hadn't disappeared without a reason. Half a mile in, Ranger stopped. He sniffed the ground, then looked at her. She followed his gaze to a small clearing where a fallen log lay half-buried in snow. Tucked behind it was a weathered metal box, almost invisible if not for Ranger's alert. Grace knelt down and pried it open. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was a bundle of papers. Gallagher's journal, water-damaged but legible. Names, dates, photos, testimonies. Everything he had tried to expose. Her breath caught. This was the final piece. Not just evidence, but his voice. A record of what he saw, what he risked, and why he ran out of time. He hadn't disappeared to hide. He'd been trying to finish what her father started. And now she would make sure it didn't stay buried. Grace stood slowly, her hand resting on Ranger's head. "You brought me here," she whispered. "You never gave up on him." The next few weeks passed in a blur of court hearings, press releases, and official statements. The department was forced to reckon with its own shadows. Several high-ranking officers were indicted. Policy reforms were introduced for K-9 treatment and internal accountability. But none of it would have happened without Ranger, the dog who waited, who remembered, who refused to let the truth be forgotten. On a quiet spring morning, Grace stood at the cemetery where her father was buried. A new stone had been added beside his, Tom Gallagher, finally laid to rest, his name cleared, his legacy honored. Ranger sat between the graves, his body still, his eyes watching the wind in the trees. And for the first time in a very long time, Grace Halstead felt peace. Not because justice had been served, but because she'd kept a promise that began long before she ever knew it was hers to keep.